And also, to let people know why these places are so special, and to talk about the avian phenomena that are associated with these locations. So I think the best place to start is actually with a well-known birding spot that's actually part of the National Seashore. It's Fort Hill in Eastham. This is arguably one of the best birding locations on the Outer Cape. It's actually not a very big area. It can be covered easily, probably in an hour or so, and the trails are really easy to sort of navigate. So one of the things that's an interesting draw is that there are a lot of nice breeding birds at Fort Hill. So if you go there during the spring and early summer, you're likely to see birds like the song sparrow on the upper left, or American goldfinches, the bird in the bottom square, and then some not so common breeders like the brown thrasher in the upper right hand corner. So I mean, on a good morning in early June, it's not unusual to be able to get 30 species at Fort Hill. Other birds to look for there in late summer, it's a pretty good spot for gathering barn swallows. A lot of the young of the year actually start to congregate there, and they'll frequently perch on some of the fences on the main drive up to the upper parking lot. But again, later in the summer, you'll get a lot of birds that don't necessarily breed at Fort Hill. They're starting to disperse after they've successfully bred, and sometimes these birds will wander up to 30 or 40 miles from the area where they actually nested. But really, the main attraction at Fort Hill is a phenomenon that ornithologists call vagrancy. And vagrancy is when birds actually end up wandering well outside of their normal range. And in some cases, it's hundreds of miles or even thousands of miles from where they should be for the winter. And one of the birds that is a bird that occurs annually in Massachusetts, but often turns up on the Cape in September and October, and sometimes into November, is the Western kingbird. Many of you are probably familiar with the Eastern kingbird. It's one of our more common songbirds and breeds in a number of locations on the Outer Cape. It's a very common migrant in May. This is the Western counterpart to the Eastern kingbird, and this bird breeds extensively west of the Mississippi River in North America. Again, this is a bird that typically shows up a lot of times after we've had really strong westerly winds, but Fort Hill is a place where they've turned up on a number of occasions. Some other western vagrants that show up are scissor-tailed flycatcher. So going to Fort Hill is a good birding experience pretty much all year long, but it gets particularly exciting in September and October and into early November, when you never know what's going to turn up. But the rarity aspect of this sort of rare bird phenomenon that I find the most interesting is the degrees of rarity with some of these vagrant species. So we have some birds like the Western kingbird that a few of these birds, maybe a half dozen, might show up in the state in the course of a fall. But then there are some birds like the Lark sparrow on the left that turn up in higher numbers. They're a little more frequent, even though they're still rare. So you may end up with 8 or 10 birds reported in the state in the course of a fall and early winter. Or the bird on the right, which is a Bell's Vireo, that sort of drab greenish bird with a single white wing bar. That's a bird that turns up in thickets near the coast in smaller numbers, but seems to be increasing in recent years. There seem to be more reports of this bird turning up. In fact, there was one at Fort Hill back about a month ago or so that stuck around for a few weeks. So starting about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, they started to become a little more regular. Nobody really knows exactly what's going on with some of these changes in the vagrancy of species, but that's one to look for in the future. It might become a bird that actually starts to become more frequent.
Jim, what did you say the name of that is?
That's a Bell's Vireo.
Okay, 'cause I think I got that in my yard.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's possible. This is certainly a bird that will turn up in thickets, and they can be conspicuous for a little drab bird. They often forage on the edges of weedy areas and out in the open. So if you can get a picture, that would be really, really cool.
Yeah, it goes in and out of a birdhouse that I have in the yard.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah,
It
well,
was
I mean, that's one
through
of
my eye
the,
because it was kind of greenish.
yeah, yeah. Well, we also have another species that turns up more frequently called the orange-crowned warbler that actually is a very late lingering species of warbler that's very greenish overall, that looks similar, and they actually come to suet feeders sometimes. But certainly, if you can get a picture or
Okay,
video, that would be really, really neat.
great.
Another big draw on the Cape is shorebird migration. And really, shorebird migration on the Cape is really all about paying attention to the tides and the topography of the outer Cape. So it really depends on where you are and where you want to do your shorebirding. You really, if you're in a place like Nauset Bay at Coast Guard Beach and you want to see shorebirds, you want to be there on a low tide. Basically, they need the extensive flats, and that's when you're more likely to run into these birds. So a lot of these shorebirds are actually migrating from the high Arctic and subarctic, and they're only coming through for a pretty narrow window of time. If you're looking for birds in another place like Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary, for example, a lot of times it's good to look for the shorebirds on a rising tide or a high tide because they get pushed into an area called Goose Pond, which is mostly flats in the summertime, except when it's a particularly high tide, 12 feet plus. And as the tide starts to go out, those birds move back out to the tidal flats. But it really is a matter of elevation. So in some places like Chipman's Cove in Wellfleet, it seems that there's a little more in the way of elevation close to the coast. So the shorebirds have some more options. They can move a little higher in response to the rising tide. And there's actually a breakwater at Chipman's Cove that can be a really interesting place to look for shorebirds when the tide is as high as it's going to get, because a lot of times the birds will just jump from the available sand right up onto the jetty and wait until the tide drops again. But what happens is other birds that are in the area, other shorebirds that are in the area that are using lower lying flats, they get pushed off those flats and they start to move around in response to the rising tide. And they look for these other places that are a little bit higher than the surrounding areas. So they tend to concentrate in these places. So sometimes you might see just a handful of birds pop onto the jetty on a rising tide, but then they get joined by more flocks as the tide gets higher and higher. So that's a really good way to find migrant shorebirds, is to find these places that have a little bit of elevation, especially on the bay side of the Cape. So we're fortunate to have both breeders and migrant shorebirds here on Cape Cod, and the bird on the left is a greater yellowlegs, which is not a breeding bird in Massachusetts. Its closest breeding area is Newfoundland, but it's an abundant migrant bird, and it's a fairly early migrant. They usually show up in Massachusetts in the spring around mid-April and really start to peak around late April, early May. The bird on the right is probably familiar to most of you. That's the willet, which is a very common breeding shorebird here on Cape Cod. But as you can see, they look pretty similar to one another. A couple of major differences is that the greater yellowlegs has a very long and finely tipped bill that's slightly upturned at the end. And if you look closely enough, you can see that true to its name, it actually has yellow legs. And when they first arrive in the spring, their hormones are basically raging, and their legs become much more yellow when they first arrive. The legs are still yellow later in the season, but they're not as bright. They become a little more orange over time. Willets, when they first arrive on territory, are extremely vocal. They give a lot of really loud calls. They get their name from their call, but they have a few other interesting calls that sound a little bit to me like a 1990s car alarm. But they'll let you know if you're anywhere near their nest. They fly tight circles around and they call constantly. They frequently perch on cedars and small trees right on the edges of the marshes to advertise their territories. So if you see a fairly decent sized shorebird perched, teed up on top of a tree, it's probably the willet. But one interesting aspect about these shorebirds is that over the course of the summer and into the early fall, they have significant changes to their plumage. Their feathers become worn, they become bleached by the sun, and they start to lose a lot of the distinctive traits that they had in the spring. So here you can see a greater yellowlegs. This picture was probably taken in late September, and the sides of the bird are much lighter and don't have the barring, the fine barring that you saw. If I go back, bird on the left here is in fresh breeding plumage. It has a lot of bars and a lot of speckles on the head and on the breast. It's a much more contrasting plumage in the spring, but here it is later in the season. And unfortunately, a lot of these shorebirds are starting to move toward various shades of gray. So they start to look more and more like each other over the course of the summer and into the early fall. So really, a few things you want to look for are behavioral characteristics and posture, and even seeing a bird in silhouette. You can learn certain aspects of their behavior that you can pick out even when they're in silhouette. So here's a look at the willet. This was probably taken in late September. Also, it's a bird that becomes much more drab. It loses a lot of those bars and speckles that you saw in the earlier image. Here's the bird on the right, probably in early May when it first arrives on Cape Cod. But here's a much heavier bill, bluntly tipped bill. Even though it's similar to the greater yellowlegs, the bill is a really good clue. But also, we have a subspecies of willet that is called the western willet that occurs here in small numbers in the fall. These birds actually have a disjunct population that's actually in the plains of the western part of the United States and southern Canada. And small numbers actually migrate to the East Coast and join our coastal willets for a brief time before moving south. A good number of these birds actually winter in Florida. And if you're in Florida in January, you're likely to see wintering willets just kind of running amongst people on busy beaches. So they're pretty desensitized to human activity. But here you can see a series of images on the left of a western willet that I photographed this past September near Chipman's Cove. And they have longer, more finely tipped bills. They have longer legs. The bills are somewhat slightly upturned at the end. They have longer necks. They're much paler than the willets that breed on the Cape. And these birds are birds that breed in fresh water in the plains of the western US and southern Canada. But the willets that you see on the Cape are chiefly associated with salt water. But if you look hard enough in September, even late August, you might find one of these western willets, the subspecies, that has traveled quite a distance to spend some time on the East Coast with our resident willets before they move south. Also, I was fortunate enough to get a picture. The quality isn't so great, but it actually shows this bird in the center is a western willet with 3 eastern coastal willets behind it for contrast. And you can see here that the bill is much more finely tipped. It's longer. It's also a much grayer, more pallid bird. And also you can see that there's white on the breast that connects to the belly and the throat. And that's not typically the case with our coastal willets. They have gray that kind of separates the white on the throat from the belly. And also the Western willets tend to have a more uniformly gray back and wings. But our coastal birds that breed on the Cape in their non-breeding plumage have dark backs that contrast with lighter wings. So it's always a treat when you find one of these in the mix, but they're not particularly common. We, a few birds here and there, but it's always a nice treat when they turn up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about passage migrants. So passage migrants are migratory birds that actually don't breed in Massachusetts, but they actually spend some time in the state during both the spring and fall migration periods. So spring migration in Massachusetts for perching birds and shorebirds tends to be sort of basically condensed into a pretty narrow window of time. Most of our perching birds arrive in the month of May. Some early birds start to arrive in April, but really the bulk of our migrants that aren't breeding in Massachusetts move through in the month of May. Shorebird migration tends to be a little more protracted. It can start a little earlier in April and last a little longer into June, and in some cases even early July for some lingering migrant shorebirds. And in the fall, the migration is much more protracted for both perching birds and shorebirds because there's really no rush to stake out your territory. It's a more leisurely flight to their wintering grounds. There's no competition for prime habitat for breeding. So birds tend to take their time. They find key feeding areas and they spend more time actually putting fat on their flight muscles in order to get to where they need to be for the winter. So I think a really cool passage migrant shorebird that occurs on Cape Cod. It's fairly common, especially in the month of August, is the Ruddy Turnstone. This is an appropriately named bird. It uses that sort of anvil-shaped bill to flip stones over and broken shells, looking for tiny insects. It eats a lot of polychaete worms. You'll see them pulling the worms right out of the mud on the mud flats. This is a bird that's still in its breeding plumage, has a really contrasting sort of orange and black calico patterned back. It's really a pretty spectacular shorebird. It's a medium-sized shorebird too, probably about 10 inches long or so. Bright orange legs when it's in its breeding plumage. And it has that really complex pattern of black and white on the face and breast and sides. This is a bird that prefers rocky areas, but sometimes you'll find it in wide open sandy stretches where there's good food available. This is a high Arctic breeding bird that actually just passes through the state. It spends in small numbers. It'll actually winter on Cape Cod and the south coast of Massachusetts, but it's never common in the wintertime. We're right at the northern terminus of its range. Here's the same species in its non-breeding plumage. You can see that it becomes a much more cryptic and camouflaged bird when it's not in its breeding plumage, and it blends in with the background with the seaweed and the stones incredibly well. And sometimes they're not really conspicuous when they're on migration, or the few birds that actually winter in our area can be pretty easily overlooked. This image shows you just how well their non-breeding plumage helps them stay out of sight. So I've counted these birds several times, and there are 13 birds in this image, believe it or not. But this is a classic example, and actually their preferred habitat type with these little boulders and these little stones. They prefer this rocky sort of habitat on the coastline. If you're looking for shorebirds on the Outer Cape, you're likely to run into a group of small shorebirds. There are several species that are known collectively as peeps. They get their name, peeps, because of the high-pitched calls. A lot of times they just have single note calls or several notes that they give in quick succession that are really high-pitched. They don't really have what we would call a song. And in some cases where the feeding is good, it's not unusual to get hundreds of each of these species congregating in one place. So historically, Monomoy Island and South Beach were really good places for congregating migrant peeps, like the semi-palmated sandpiper on the left. The bird on the right is a least sandpiper. They do look very similar to one another. If you look at the semi-palmated sandpiper on the left, this is a bird that's about 7.5 inches long or so. And it has a thicker, more substantial, all dark bill that's bluntly tipped, and it always has black legs. The bird on the right is about 6 inches long or so, the least sandpiper, and it has greenish yellow legs in all ages, and a finely tipped, slightly drooping, smaller bill. But they often are found at the same time together on mud flats. And again, you can see in some key locations on Cape Cod, hundreds of these species at one time. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of our breeding shorebirds here on the Cape. The piping plover on the left is a fairly common breeder on Cape Cod these days. And the American oyster catcher, not as common, but seems to be increasing on Cape Cod. One thing I wanted to point out is really when it comes to shorebirds and their structure, their morphology, it's really about adaptations. And these adaptations, the bill size and shape, the sort of foraging behaviors, their posture, the overall way that they're built is basically a response to their food preferences and the habitats that they're using to get their food. So the piping plover is actually a visual forager. It actually spends its time looking for its prey items. So it'll pursue little aquatic invertebrates, insects that are on the sand, by running a few steps and looking around and actually visually detecting its prey. It doesn't really spend much time using its tactile sense with its bill to find prey. So it has a little bill that it uses just to glean things from the surface. The American oyster catcher on the right-hand side here is a bird that has that impossibly long orange bill that's basically like a butter knife attached to its head. It's laterally flattened toward the end, and it can use it to pry open mollusks. So apparently they are sometimes visual foragers when they're in shallow water and they're looking for things like mussels and scallops and things like that. But they use their tactile sense. They can actually feel their prey with their bills when they're looking for things like clams and probing the sand. It's true of a number of birds like dowitchers. You may see short-billed dowitchers in pretty good numbers on the coast. They have this characteristic sewing machine motion that they do with their bills. They just probe the sand up and down repeatedly. They're relying on their sense of feel almost entirely to feel the prey items that are below the surface. Those birds and some other species of shorebirds have what's called a rhynchokinetic bill. They can actually not only feel the prey with the bill, but they can flex the tip only. They can open and close the end of their bill without opening the rest of it, so they can seize prey below the surface of the mud. We have a few other unusual breeders here on Cape Cod, like the American woodcock on the left. This is a shorebird that a lot of people have not seen unless they've actually gone out of their way to see this bird during its courtship display in the spring, or if you just happen upon one of these birds as it's moving between its nesting site with young to a prime feeding area, or occasionally just by chance when it's crossing a trail. They tend to like wet and damp areas with lots of thickets on the edge. They spend a lot of time probing in wet leaf litter, and they basically stay out of sight. And as you can see, they're pretty well camouflaged for a ground that's covered with wet leaves, and also covered with lots of brambles and thickets. But this is a shorebird species, even though it doesn't breed on the coast. They do have a spectacular spring courtship display that usually occurs anytime from late February through the month of March. What they do is the males go out to the edge of a field where several females have gathered, and the male launches itself after making several insect-like peent calls repeatedly. It basically flies up fairly high, and once it gets up about maybe 50 feet, 60 feet or so, it does this really complex zigzag flight back down to the ground, and it makes a twittering noise that's actually not a vocalization. It's actually produced by the air passing over some of its flight feathers on the way down. And then when it gets to the ground, it starts to vocalize with that very strange insect-like peent call again. So there are, a number of good places to see these birds doing this display. Fort Hill is a location. If you go there at twilight, that's when the birds start to do their thing. Wellfleet Bay, the Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary, the field next to the nature center, is a good spot to look for them late February through March, particularly on a calm night. Any night without wind is generally a good time to be out there. There's a pretty narrow window of opportunity to see these birds, so you really want to face, the direction where the sun is going down to get what remains of the light to see these birds in silhouette as they're doing this really complex courtship display. The bird on the right is a killdeer,
really
which is
spectacular.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely amazing.
They go really high.
They do. And the bird on the right is a killdeer. It's actually a plover, and it's a bird that you wouldn't find nesting on the coast. They sometimes during migration show up on mud flats, but it's really uncommon. This is a bird that prefers agricultural fields and waste areas. And believe it or not, they'll even breed sometimes on the roof of a large building like a mall or a supermarket. And they'll use waste areas, just abandoned lots, things like that. They don't really build much of a nest. It's basically a scrape in the sand. But they have a really interesting behavior that's known as a distraction display. So anytime a potential predator comes anywhere near this bird and its nest, it actually feigns a broken wing. It actually pretends that it's got a broken wing, and it drags the one wing behind it so that the predator will follow it away from the nest and eggs. And then when you're about maybe 15 or 20 feet from the nest or the young, the bird just flies away. It's not the only species that does that. Piping plovers actually have a similar distraction display, but it's not quite as refined as the killdeer. And there are a number of other shorebird species that have other interesting displays that are meant to distract a potential predator from the eggs or the nestlings. Another real highlight of birding on the Outer Cape is, because there are these really nice shorebirding spots and really good concentrations of shorebirds, every now and then something rare turns up. And this is a Wilson's phalarope, which is actually a Western species primarily that breeds in fresh water in the plains of mostly northwestern US and southern Canada. But it has some outlier populations where it has bred pretty much from the upper Midwest all the way to New England and the maritime provinces of Canada. We've even got a few breeding records here in Massachusetts. This bird is bred on Monomoy Island, Plum Island, in the 50s and 60s. And I think the Monomoy record is from 1980. But it's not a common breeder, but it has bred locally in the past. But it's always a treat when something like this shows up in the mix with the passage migrants and breeding shorebirds. This is a bird that will show up both in the spring migration and the fall migration. This is a bird that was at Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary in May of 2019. I think for most people, though, one of the biggest draws for birding on the Outer Cape is the spring passerine or perching bird migration. And probably the best spot on the Outer Cape for looking for migrant perching birds or songbirds is Beech Forest, also part of the National Seashore in Provincetown. This is really an important spot because it's what ornithologists refer to as a migrant trap. So a lot of these perching birds migrate at night. They migrate at night to avoid predators because it's cooler. They can conserve energy because it's so much cooler to move at night. But really, they can avoid a lot of predators by moving at night. And as soon as day breaks, they stop the feed for the day and put on as much fat on their flight muscles as possible to get to their next destination. And some of these birds that are moving at night, especially on cloudy nights when they can't use the stars as part of their repertoire of navigation, they'll actually get disoriented and end up blown offshore. And also on nights when there's strong winds, especially nights that start off relatively calm and then pick up just before daybreak. These birds will actually get blown offshore, and then as soon as the sun starts to come up, these birds have to stop and find appropriate habitat to feed for the day. So really, they're kind of wandering around looking for land, and if they happen to get out close to Race Point in those areas, they'll sometimes land in very inappropriate habitat, like some of the coastal thickets, bayberry, things like that, and then look for more appropriate habitat. And that's what brings them to a place like Beech Forest, because you've got plenty of cover, lots of insect activity, lots of different species of trees, lots of understory and dense growth so that they can get cover and food and feed for the day before they reorient themselves and continue on. So we're lucky to have a lot of warblers move through that area in the month of May. Yellow-Rumped Warbler is one of the more common migrant warblers, and this is a bird that actually arrives a little earlier than most of our warblers. Some of these birds really start to show up in good numbers around the third week of April. So anytime from the third week of April until the middle part of May, these birds are moving through the area. So the bird on the right is actually in its breeding plumage. This is what they would look like in the month of May. The bird on the left is the same species in its fall plumage, a much drabber plumage that helps them go undetected when they're moving south. So I put both the spring and the fall plumages up here to show you that there's quite a range in terms of the differences in spring and non-breeding plumage in some of these warblers. So the yellow-rumped is a fairly big difference with regard to its feather characteristics. Another species to be on the lookout for is the palm warbler. And this bird, the bird on the left is a palm warbler in its spring plumage, and the bird on the right is a palm warbler and its non-breeding plumage. And here, the difference is a little more subtle. They look pretty similar in the spring and the fall. This is a bird that typically shows up in April as well, and migrates through our area and turns up at places like Beech Forest through the middle part of May. Interestingly, though, this is a bird that has very different breeding habitat It breeds in boreal forests, the northern forests of Canada and northern New England, on the edges of bogs. But in the fall, you'll find it in weedy fields and in the brushy edges of fields, and it frequently pumps its tail. So it raises and lowers its tail on a regular basis. So that's one good ID tip for separating it from some of the other warblers. It's not the only warbler that does that. Some prairie warblers do it as well, but it's a pretty good identification clue. Then there's the black-polled warbler. And here we have a male on the right and a female on the left. And poll is actually just an old term for a bird's cap or crown. And it still exists in some of the bird names like black-polled warbler and common red-poll. This is a bird that tends to be on the later side with regard to migrant perching birds in Massachusetts. And some birders always say that when they start to hear their black-polled warblers moving through the area, the migration is all over. This is a bird that really peaks a little later in the month of May and sometimes lingers into the end of May and early June. But one reason that I chose to talk about this species is because it has a pretty radical transformation in the fall to a very different plumage. So much so that in Audubon's day, the ornithologists of Audubon's time referred to this as autumn warbler. They did not know it was the same species as the black-polled warbler because it was so different in appearance. And for a long time, they were puzzled about what the species was. And they were like, this bird only shows up in September and early October. And then we don't see it in the spring. So it took a little while for people to figure out, early ornithologists to figure out it was just the fall plumage of the black-polled warbler. But one way to separate this bird from some similar looking warblers like the bay-breasted warbler, which is not a very common warbler, is the orange feet on this bird. So even in its drab plumage, the orange feet are a pretty good clue to separating it from some similar looking birds. Other birds to look for in Beech Forest and some of the other areas on the Outer Cape is the rose-breasted grosbeak. And I mean, one of the really interesting things about birding the Outer Cape in May is that because the Cape stays so much cooler later into the spring, leaf out time is delayed by a couple of weeks. And that can be a real advantage when you're looking for warblers and brightly colored songbirds like this rose-breasted grosbeak. I was actually commuting from southeastern Massachusetts to Wellfleet for quite a while in the spring of 2019. And it was like going back in time every morning for me at points in the month of May. Things were completely leafed out at home. You couldn't see any small songbirds that were in the trees. You could hear plenty of things, but finding them was a real challenge. And then I would get to the Outer Cape and there were just small leaflets on the trees. And basically it was much easier to detect some of these really spectacular looking breeding songbirds. And that's one of the big attractions for Beech Forest, for birders from all over the state, is that if you get there in early to mid-May, you can get really good looks at these birds. And there are a number of places in Beech Forest where you can look straight out and see some of these birds because of the elevation of the trails. And you won't have to suffer what birders call warbler neck from looking straight up for extended periods of time, which is always a treat. So some of the other things to look for are long distance and short distance migrants at places like Beech Forest. So this bird that you see on the left is a blue-gray gnatcatcher. It's tiny, it's frenetic. It's an early migrant. It usually shows up in Massachusetts in mid to late April. By contrast, on the right, we have the eastern kingbird, which is a long distance migrant that actually comes all the way from Western South America, the Amazon basin, and it comes all the way up to Massachusetts to breed. The blue-gray gnatcatcher, on the other hand, a good number of them winter in the southern part of the United States, from the Carolinas down through Florida and Texas. So they're not coming from anywhere near as far away. Another thing that birders are always on the lookout for at places like Beech Forest or any of these migrant traps, these patches of green that you can find on the outer Cape that have plenty of food and plenty of cover, are what we call these southern overshoot species. So these are birds that actually breed just south of New England. Both the yellow-throated warbler on the top image and the summer tanager on the bottom image breed as close as the state of New Jersey. So Cape May, New Jersey, both of these species breed there. They're fairly common in the appropriate habitat. But it's always a treat to find them here in Massachusetts where they do not breed. And they typically show up after we've had some really strong southerly or southwesterly winds. And what happens is these birds end up getting carried beyond their normal breeding spot, breeding areas into Massachusetts. And the birds that get pushed offshore overnight are looking to get to land as quickly as possible. And a place like Beech Forest is really a good spot for these birds to be able to kind of reorient themselves and feed for the day. I'd like to talk about Race Point. Race Point is definitely one of the top birding destinations in Massachusetts, but it's actually well known to birders all over North America. And one of the reasons it's so attractive to local birders is that it's one of the best land-based seabirding places in the state. It's actually one of the best land-based birding locations in North America. And it's particularly attractive to people who don't like boats. Anybody who's ever gotten seasick knows they can go and see these birds without having to worry about moving. There's no motion. If you can park yourself on the beach with a scope and watch these birds as they get fairly close to shore. And it's really contingent upon the wind direction. So you can see birds like this great shearwater in the image. This is a southern hemisphere breeding bird. It actually breeds on the Tristan da Cunha Islands in the south central Atlantic. And it spends most of its life far offshore, except for a brief period where it comes to land to breed. But it spends the austral winter in our waters. So it actually moves north during the southern hemisphere's winter to spend its time in our waters in our summer. Sometimes it can be very abundant, but again, it's a bird that is typically found well offshore, and it's adapted to spending its life on the water surface. It can drink salt water. It has special glands that remove the salt from its system, and it sleeps on the water. Again, if you go on a day where there's a pretty strong easterly or northeasterly wind in the summertime, and if there's good bait fish concentrations around the rips at Race Point, this is a bird that you can see fairly close to shore. Nor'easters also tend to drive them closer to shore or into the bay. So you can sometimes see them on the bay side during a really strong nor'easter. Talk a little bit more about the phenomenon of birds being driven into the bay during a nor'easter in just a few more minutes. Another big attraction on Race Point is the gulls. Lots and lots of gulls congregate there in the wintertime. Most of them are common breeding gulls like herring gulls, great blackback gulls, also wintering ring-billed gulls concentrate there in big numbers. But sometimes you can get good numbers of what are referred to as white-winged gulls. So like this Iceland gull that you see here is a first winter Iceland gull. Glaucous gull is pretty similar. It's a bigger, more robust bird, but it looks pretty similar in its first winter plumage. When they first arrive, they look beige with that checkered pattern on their wings, but over time that gets worn and bleached and they become much whiter overall. So they really jump out when they're in the mix with a bunch of gulls, especially when they're in flight. This is a bird that's a little bit smaller than a herring gull, but it's one to look for if you're on Race Point in the wintertime. It does not breed in Massachusetts. It's a visitor from northern areas of Canada and southern Greenland. But also there's some interesting smaller birds that you're likely to encounter if you're birding around Race Point. It's always important to check the dunes and any parking lots or open areas near the dunes for birds like the snow bunting on the left, which is actually a high Arctic breeding sparrow that spends the winter in small flocks in Massachusetts. Sometimes the flocks can get up to 40 or 50 birds, but you're more likely to run into birds that maybe a dozen or 15, and they tend to move around quite a bit. So there could be quite a few of them in a parking lot near the dunes one day, and then you might not see them again for several weeks. The horned lark on the right is a bird that actually breeds in small numbers in coastal dune areas in Massachusetts. But it's joined by migrant birds that winter in the same habitat here in Massachusetts. And they also use agricultural fields. Both species are also found in agricultural fields and other big open places in the state of Massachusetts. But it's always fun to look for them in places like Race Point. It's always good to keep an eye on the sky when you're in that area too. The Province Lands area hosts some interesting raptors in the wintertime. So this bird on the left is a Merlin. It's a little falcon, kind of a mini version of the peregrine falcon that isn't a real abundant species, but we get some birds that spend the winter on the Outer Cape. This is a bird that I photographed at High Head a few years ago, and the bird on the right is actually a northern harrier, which is actually breeds in small numbers in the Province Lands and in places like Monomoy and other dune areas on the Outer Cape. Also like to talk about Mcmillan Wharf, because Mcmillan Wharf is definitely worth a visit. And it's really not particularly productive at any season other than winter. I mean, you can see some interesting breeding gulls and things like that during the summer months, but winter is really prime time for a visit to Mcmillan Wharf in Provincetown Harbor. And it's really about the nor'easters that I was talking about earlier. What happens is a lot of times seabirds get driven into Cape Cod Bay by nor'easter because the low pressure system actually has counterclockwise spinning winds. Depending on the track of the storm, much like whether we get snow or rain in parts of southeastern Massachusetts, if the storm track is just right and it actually moves toward the northeast, sort of in the way that is depicted here in these images, those counterclockwise winds actually drive seabirds into the bay, and those birds will actually, we're talking about sea ducks like common eiders and scoters, some gulls, even some late lingering shorebirds will move around and just swirl around inside Cape Cod Bay for the duration of the storm, and also seek shelter in protected areas. And in some cases, they'll actually use some of the freshwater ponds that are close to shore. And frequently what happens, depending on the track of the storm, is that as the storm is exiting, the nor'easter is actually moving farther to the northeast. The northwesterly winds on the backside of the storm actually push the birds out of the bay. And sometimes it can be absolutely spectacular show with thousands of birds involved. And when this happens, a lot of times the birds actually use areas like First Encounter Beach because it's a really narrow piece of land and they're up high enough that they can see the open ocean and they actually just cut right across the land to get back to the open ocean. So when the conditions are just right, there can be thousands of birds involved, just incredible numbers of scoters, gannets, northern gannets, hundreds, and also some other birds like alcids, which I will talk about in a minute, that move in really big numbers during these conditions. So Provincetown Harbor is an ideal place, Mcmillan Wharf specifically, but the harbor generally, because it's protected by both north winds, northeast winds, and west winds because of this roughly triangular shape that you see here. The birds can actually deal with storms just by being in the harbor area in general. But some of these birds are even more protected when they seek refuge in the wharf, because you've got the addition of docks and boats that actually provide additional protection. And sometimes some of these birds will spend time very close to the docks and actually swim and dive amongst the boats. And they'll really allow for a close approach. In some cases, they'll only be feet away, which is a real treat. So one of those species is the Dovekey, which is actually in the alcid family, which includes our Atlantic puffin. This is a much smaller bird. This bird's only about 8 inches long, not much bigger than a songbird. And sometimes when there's a nor'easter, there can be hundreds of these birds involved in a flight. And some of them find the safe haven that is Mcmillan Wharf, and they'll stick around for a few days, sometimes a week after a pretty good storm. And it's during those times that you can go and actually get really good close looks at these birds if you're lucky. Another alcid is the thick-billed murre, and this is a bird that turns up occasionally in the same place. And if you're lucky enough, you'll be close enough to get really good looks at this bird. So both the Dovekey and the thick-billed murre are real high Arctic breeders that breed in places. The Dovekeys breed in places like Svalbard and Arctic Norway and Greenland. Thick-billed murre actually breeds in northern maritime provinces, places like Iceland. These birds are the Dovekey breeds in these scree slopes, these areas where there's lots of broken up slopes of broken up rock. The thick-billed murre is a steep cliff breeder. And these are really difficult and inaccessible places that are really difficult for predators to reach. So they breed in some pretty difficult areas to access. Other birds to look for there are interesting gulls like this lesser blackback gull. This is a first-year lesser blackback gull. It's a little smaller than a herring gull. They actually don't breed in Massachusetts, but they're increasing as fall migrants and winter visitors. There's been an explosion in their population in Iceland in the past 30 to 40 years. And we may be getting some of these Western European birds showing up in the maritime provinces of Canada and into New England, but they've really started to turn up in lots of places in Eastern North America in the past 30 years or so. But also common birds like the red-breasted merganser. This is a sea duck that is a fairly common wintering bird here in Massachusetts. And this is a female on the left and a male on the right. And again, you can get really good close looks at these birds. The mergansers actually have serrated bills for seizing their fish prey. That really narrow bill, when it opens the bill, you can see it has almost these tooth-like serrations on the bill. And birds like the common eider, which actually breed in Massachusetts, they're fairly easy to see in the wintertime from Mcmillan Wharf. We've got a white-winged scoter on the left and a female greater scaup, both birds that were spending time at the wharf just after storm. I just wanted to point out that a lot of times birds like the white-winged scoter are, they're bouncing around in the surf, several hundred yards offshore a lot of the time. There might be lots of them, several hundred, in some cases, 1,000+ birds, but a lot of times they're just beyond binocular range. So it's really a treat to be able to get a nice close extended look at these birds from only 10 or 15 feet away. I just wanted to add too that there's some pretty fancy looking pigeons down at Mcmillan Wharf too. I've seen some really interesting aberrant plumages there. So it's always worth taking a look at the pigeon flock that spends time down there. There's probably about 40 or 50 birds most winters. They're moving around the wharf quite a bit, but there's some pretty spectacular looking pigeons down there. So well worth a peek. Just wanted to talk about a couple of other interesting aspects of some of the avian phenomena that you find on the Outer Cape. And one of those is post-breeding dispersal. So this is a phenomenon that is found in a lot of different bird groups, and it can be observed in other parts of the state, but the Cape is a particularly good place for a couple of the species that I'm going to discuss now. So post-breeding dispersal is basically when birds finish breeding, some groups of birds actually wander about quite a distance. And in a lot of cases, they move north or northeasterly up to several hundred miles from their breeding area. And two groups of birds that do this frequently are terns and herons. So one of the birds to be on the lookout for in Massachusetts, especially on the Outer Cape, in late July through August, is the little blue heron. And this is a little blue heron in its breeding plumage. It's sort of a slaty, purplish blue bird overall with a bicolored bill, lighter at the base and darker at the tip. It's much smaller than the great blue heron, and it's more of a southern bird. So it's fairly common when you get to the southern states as a breeder. But it only breeds in small numbers in Massachusetts. It's not a common breeder at all. However, in the summertime, some birds that breed in places like Western Connecticut and Long Island actually move up into southeastern Massachusetts and end up on the Cape. And frequently they're first-year birds, the immature birds, like this bird on the bottom image. The problem is they look very similar to our snowy egrets. They're about the size of a snowy egret, so they can blend in very easily with our snowy egret flocks. But one way to tell them apart is they have that bicolored bill, and it's much thicker. And again, that darker end to the bill and the lighter base, but also the yellowish legs overall. So juvenile snowy egrets have some yellow on their legs, but they also have some black on the fronts and backs of their legs. Also, immature little blue herons have some dusky tips sometimes to their flight feathers. So if you look at the back of the bird, you can sometimes see little bluish colored dots. It's always fun when one of these birds turns up amongst the snowy egrets. Sometimes you see them alone, but more often than not, they're embedded with the local snowies. Another bird to be on the lookout for is the yellow-crowned night heron. This is a bird that was actually formerly a much more common breeder on Cape Cod, but now its range is a little more southern these days. But we still do get post-breeding dispersed birds, especially immature birds like the bird in this image that show up on the Outer Cape in July and August. This past summer was a really good year for yellow-crowned night herons, actually not just on the Cape, but all throughout eastern Massachusetts. Birds are even turning up in public parks and habitat that's not typical for the species. So these birds actually spend most of the time foraging at night and roosting during the day, but they are sometimes active during the day. So a bird to be on the lookout for if you're out at that time of year. Another bird is the Forster's tern, which is a bird, again, that breeds as closely as Long Island. There are breeding colonies there, but it habitually moves into Massachusetts and especially the Cape in July and August. And these days, it's not unusual to get 30 or 40 birds at a location, but more often than not, you see a bird or two mixed in with the more common terns, which do breed on Cape Cod. Here's a group of them in their non-breeding plumage, and they sometimes can look like non-breeding plumaged common terns, but they have these isolated black ovals over their eyes that don't connect on the back of the head. Common terns can sometimes have those narrow black patches, but they connect on the back of the head. And also the Forster's terns in flight are much lighter colored overall. They look very whitish compared to the non-breeding common terns. So they really jump out when they're in a flock of common terns. And also another thing that is always interesting about the Cape is its lingering migrants and semi-hardy thicket birds in the winter. So because the Cape stays so much warmer in the winter, because it's surrounded by water, the temperatures can sometimes be 8 to 10 degrees warmer than areas that are just 50 or 60 miles west of the outer Cape. And some birds that breed here, like the eastern towhee, a large sparrow that breeds mostly in pitch pine barrens and areas with young white pine saplings, they will sometimes try to hang on for the winter, especially in our coastal thickets. This is a bird that routinely shows up on our winter bird surveys in small numbers. The gray catbird is another bird that tries to overwinter in coastal thickets on Cape Cod and the South Coast, especially if there's enough fruit for these birds to feed on. So anywhere there are bittersweet thickets, you're likely to run into some of these birds if the conditions are right. They're especially attracted to places with a slope that's south-facing that gets maximum sunlight through the course of the day. It'll stay that much warmer. But also birds like this hermit thrush on the bottom left and this warbler, the common yellow throat. Both of these birds will spend time in our coastal thickets. And if the winter is not too severe, some of these birds will actually survive. So what's the advantage of staying in these coastal thickets a little outside of your normal wintering range? Well, it's a huge advantage to be that much closer to your prime breeding habitat if you're able to stay as close to it as possible. And some of these birds don't make it, unfortunately, especially when we have a very severe winter, but some do. So it's a bird that some of these birds are birds that you may encounter in some of the locations that I've talked about tonight. Lastly, I'd like to talk about birds that are at the northern limit of their winter range. And we have a number of birds that are basically not super common birds here in the wintertime. And Cape Cod and the south coast of Massachusetts and coastal Connecticut are kind of the northern limit of their range. The conditions are optimal for them to be able to hang on, mostly in coastal thickets, but in some cases not thickets. So yellow-bellied sapsucker is one. This is a migratory woodpecker that actually breeds in Massachusetts from Worcester County to the west and up into northern New England. But it migrates through Massachusetts In the spring, it shows up in mid-April, and then in the fall, it usually comes through in October. But small numbers will actually spend the winter on Cape Cod and southeastern Massachusetts, and not always in thickets. You'll find them even in semi-open areas with scattered trees. But it's always a fun one to find in the dead of winter on Cape Cod. The fox sparrow is another one that's at its northern limit in southeastern Massachusetts and Cape Cod. And this is a really big sparrow, brick red and gray markings, streaks of chevrons on its side with a really distinctive spot on the breast, much bigger than the song sparrow. This is a bird that is typically found in thickets and one to be on the lookout for. It's a bird that breeds in northern New England and southern Canada in boreal forest. So it's pretty strongly associated with fir and spruce forests and boggy areas. And that's all I have for you tonight, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
That was great, Jim. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and your enthusiasm.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself. Or you can type a question into the chat and I will read it for you. Jim, I have a question.
Sure.
So about, I think 2 weeks ago at Wildcare, we got a blue-headed vireo that struck a window.
Yep.
And we were kind of surprised to see that bird now. So it is, what happens with them at this time of year? Is that a late migrant or?
Yeah, that's definitely a late lingering migrant, and one that sometimes shows up on these winter surveys that are done on the Cape. And generally speaking, a lot of these late lingering birds are birds that winter in the United States. They're not long distance migrants, and they tend to arrive early in the spring and linger late into the fall. So blue-headed vireo is a vireo species that actually will turn up in Massachusetts and stay in Massachusetts sometimes until the end of October. It's not particularly unusual to get them that late into the fall, but December is definitely unusual. But I think that because we had such a warm fall, at least in October, and we haven't had a particularly severe late fall, we haven't had any real snow to speak of, and it hasn't been bitterly cold yet. Some of these birds will actually hang on. The ones that did linger into October and early November will actually hang on in small numbers. So it's definitely noteworthy and rare to have a blue-headed vireo that late, but it's definitely on the short list of perching birds that habitually linger late into the fall. Nice find. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful bird. He did recover. He was with us for about a week, and then we released him back. So. Oh,
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I highlighted some of the ones that you're more likely to run into, but that blue-gray gnatcatcher that I described earlier as an early spring migrant at Beech Forest, that's another bird that sometimes shows up late in November, rarely on winter bird surveys in December. But it's another one that winters mostly in the United States. So it's an early spring migrant and a late fall lingerer.
And we have a question from Jeanette. Jeanette asks, I've seen Facebook photos of Baltimore Orioles on the Cape that are still in breeding plumage. Do they go into non-breeding plumage, and are more of them trying to overwinter on Cape Cod?
So that's another bird that habitually overwinters in small numbers on Cape Cod. So every year we have a few Orioles that turn up on our Christmas bird counts and other winter surveys. It's always a treat to find one in December, but it's a bird that occurs annually in small numbers. Some of the birds are adults and they don't really they don't really molt into a different plumage, the adult birds. They're not as bright orange as they are in the spring, but they basically have the same basic color scheme, the adults. However, a lot of the birds that you see in the winter are first-year birds, which are much drabber than the adult birds. So they look kind of yellowish and gray. They're more orange concentrated on the breast, but they're not anywhere near as bright as a spring male Baltimore Oriole that's kind of flame orange and black. So yeah, certainly Baltimore Oriole is one that we always hope to find. And, you know, a lot of times you can find them in things like red cedars, you know, a sunlit red cedar right next to the coast. Those are good places to look for lingering Baltimore Orioles. But yeah, they're an established late lingerer species that occurs on the Cape pretty regularly in the winter.
Glenna has a question. Has there been any research or information on the impact of wind farms on the birds of Cape Cod?
Yes, Cape Wind Project had extensive surveys done where they actually had aerial surveys done by small planes and observers. And they were specifically looking to find out if the wind turbines would adversely affect migrating waterfowl. I mean, they were looking at all types of birds, but it was the waterfowl that spent time in the key area that they were concerned about, especially long-tailed ducks. And it turns out that long-tailed ducks, they think that, at least the last numbers that I heard, and this is probably 10 years ago or so, that 2/3 of the world's population winter between Nantucket and the Cape. That about 500,000 birds winter in that area. It's just a staggering number. So they were really particularly interested to find out if turbines would be some sort of issue with regard to long-tailed ducks that were commuting between their feeding areas and their roosting areas at night. And it turns out that they found that most of the long-tailed ducks were not spending time in the areas where the turbines were planned. But yeah, that's definitely something that has occurred, and pretty sophisticated transects that they would run with an observer on each side of the plane, keeping really detailed records about how many birds, species, and the numbers that they were able to record during those surveys.
I just have to share that I actually was part of those surveys when I worked for Mass Audubon, and it seems like a million years ago. It was like 2003, and we would count the birds in Nantucket Sound from 500 feet, and this was for the Cape Wind Farm impact. So they've been doing research on this for a long time. It's fascinating. Okay, I have a few more questions. Has anyone seen a snowy owl on Nauset Outer Beach yet? I have seen Facebook photos of snowies from last year on Outer Beach.
I have not heard any reports from Nauset, but I did see a report recently from Race Point about a week and a half ago or so. Some birders had one at Race Point. I just saw today that one turned up in the Berkshires, which is not a typical occurrence.
Cool.
But as far as I can tell, there's no real flight year happening this year. It's not a major snowy owl eruption year like a few years back in 2015 when we just had an incredible flight. So that doesn't mean that there couldn't be more birds turning up, but when they do show up, they usually show up in late November through the first few weeks of December. And there are some key places like Logan Airport where they tend to show up in small numbers every year, even if there isn't a flight going on. So Logan Airport is probably one of the best places in North America outside of the Arctic where you can actually see snowy owls reliably. Unfortunately, it's an issue of access. There's really no good place to view them from outside the airfield, but that's a place that is probably the most reliable place. But we still have a few more weeks, I think, and birds could certainly show up. And it turns out that snowy owls, based on telemetry research, they know that snowy owls just move around constantly throughout the winter. So birds that are maybe in southern New Hampshire or coastal Maine could easily show up on the Cape sometime midwinter. That's not unusual.
And are there orchard orioles on the Cape? The orioles in the yard look different from Baltimore Orioles. I had many orioles at my house this spring and have a pond in Eastham, and they were near the edge and mating.
Yes, absolutely. So orchard orioles do breed on the Cape. And interestingly, they've really increased as breeding birds throughout Massachusetts. Historically, in the past 30 years or so, there's been a pretty dramatic increase in that species. There were always a few key places in Massachusetts, some places in the Connecticut River Valley, a few places like World's End and Hingham was always a good place for multiple breeding birds. And also in recent years, they've really increased dramatically in abandoned bog areas in southeastern Massachusetts, cranberry bogs specifically. They like the scrubby edges of old bogs. So, but yeah, certainly on Cape Cod, they've increased as well. And we have a couple of breeding pairs at Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary that are fairly easy to see, and they seem to be perfectly okay with breeding fairly close to the Baltimore Orioles. So, you know, you can see them, you know, fairly close to one another in some of these locations. But yeah, much smaller than the Baltimore Oriole, and you know, that much more subdued brick red instead of the flame orange, but basically the same color scheme. Females are pretty yellowish overall, but a nice addition to our avifauna here in Massachusetts in terms of, you know, being more widespread and higher numbers.
And last question, Jim, I have a question. So for the last week, I've had golden crown kinglets eating from my suet.
Oh, nice.
Which is amazing. And I have a kind of a unique setup because I'm on the second floor in the woods. So I didn't know, is this a thing that golden crown kinglets eat from suet?
Well, I have not seen them do that, but I think what happens sometimes is they jump onto the suet to glean insects that are attracted to it. Little tiny insects that might be on the suet. They'll actually just glean them from the surface of the suet. Have you actually been able to determine that they're actually ingesting the suet, or is that not noticeable? Have you seen them actually with little pieces of suet in their bills, or?
That is not noticeable, but sometimes I'll have two at one time, and they're pretty bold. Like they'll even be, you know, hanging at the bottom, like underneath a downy woodpecker. It's
really,
I got a few photos. It is awesome. I'll try to get video though, so I can see, you know, what's in their mouth.
Yeah, that's really cool. So one thing I can suggest though is years ago, I was living in Taunton and I had a very late lingering black-throated blue warbler that was coming to my suet feeder in December. That's a bird that would normally depart Massachusetts in, you know, late September, early October. But it was mid-December and the bird actually stayed around until early February, which is very, very unusual. And this is a bird that eats insects throughout the summer. It's not a seed eater. Even when it's spending time on its wintering grounds, it's eating insects. So I was a little surprised that it was coming to the suet feeder. So I went and investigated the suet block, and I could see that there were little bill scrapes in the suet block. So if you take a really close look at the suet block, you might be able to see that there are little scrapes in it. And it turns out that when it got really, really cold, I started putting peanut butter out for the bird. And amazingly, it ate the peanut butter.
That's amazing.
And I was able to determine that by looking for the little bill scrapes in the peanut butter too. So I wasn't sure if it was getting some kind of late lingering insect that was attracted to either of those things, but.
Right. I'll take a look and I'll try to set up my camera out there.
Cool.
I love them. I hope they stay.
Yeah, they're really cool. They're one of North America's smallest songbirds. Just only about, not even 4 inches long, which is pretty amazing.
Teeny tiny.
There
I
are.
will take one last question. It is, how do you feel about spraying for mosquitoes and ticks?
My personal feelings are, I don't know that it's necessary. I think that some of the spraying actually causes more harm to birds and insects than the benefits. I really think that, from what I understand, there are a lot of the mosquito species that are responsible for triple E are very habitat specific. And I think that some of the spraying operations aren't focused on spraying those habitats only. So they end up spraying in areas where the mosquitoes that are responsible for triple E aren't even found. I think that my personal take would be, I think there are other ways to address it, like, wearing bug spray and long sleeve shirts and avoiding critical areas during twilight and the early hours of the day. But I'm open to any evidence that somebody can provide to suggest otherwise. But that's my take on it.
Yes, I agree. Well, I think we will close there. Jim, this was awesome. I'm going to put this on our YouTube page, and then I'll share the link with everyone next week or so. And then next Wednesday is the last talk of the series, and it's going to be me, and I'm going to talk about, it's called Birds, and it's about avian winter adaptations, how birds survive the cold, and why some birds stay here. So I hope you will join us. Jim, you're getting lots of great people said it was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.